Hello, and welcome to the Borneo Chronicles podcast, supported by Goethe Institute, Malaysia. Historical events are often driven by economic forces. And when we talk about the economy of Borneo in the 19th century, one of the biggest resources turned out to be a metal called antimony. Some researchers have claimed that Sarawak is actually the local name for the metal antimony itself. A country rich in resources can be both a blessing and a curse, depending on who you are. Before the 19th century, antimony has a few traditional uses. If you take the metal antimony and grind it up, you end up with a black powder. This black powder was often used as eye makeup. In fact, it has been used in ancient times. In Egypt, it was known as kohl, K-O-H-L. A second use of antimony is its use as a medicine. If you ingest antimony, it will in fact force you to throw up. This was seen as a medicine at the time. I would advise against this because antimony is extremely toxic and has the same effects as ingesting lead. And just like lead, it can be used in paints and dyes to make colors very vibrant. And in fact, this was one of the local uses for antimony, to make a very bright orange dye. You may be wondering, if antimony has such limited use, how did it ever end up driving the economy of Sarawak? At the turn of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution in Europe created new demand for materials such as antimony. Antimony has a very particular property. It's one of the few metals that actually expands as it cools. So the obvious advantage of a metal that expands as it cools is that it can be used in making very precise casting. This is how it becomes a very popular metal to use in making printing blocks. When antimony is added to alloys, it gives a secondary benefit of making the alloy stronger and harder. This makes antimony crucial to the development of machine bearings. Not only is it used in almost every single machine, it's also used in the machine of war. Antimony was used to harden things like bullets, and it was critical to the new invention of the exploding shell, commonly known as the shrapnel shell. In fact, one of the first times the shrapnel shell was used was against Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon abdicated his position as emperor just 4 days later. These constant battles in Europe had a knock-on effect on what was happening in Southeast Asia. Near the end of the 18th century, there were many republican revolutions. This is when the people decide they don't want a king anymore, they want a republic. After the French Revolution happened, a knock-on revolution happened in the Netherlands. As the revolution gained strength, King William, who thought it was a good idea to keep his head, decided it was time to take a little vacation to England. Naturally, Britain, being a monarchy herself, supported monarchies over republics. And this is how the Dutch possessions in the East Indies are passed over to Britain for safekeeping until King William can be restored. This takes almost 20 years. During those 20 years, the British first took control of Malacca and then launched an invasion of Java. Once they had captured Java, Lord Minto made Thomas Raffles the governor of Java, a position he held until 1814. Near the end of his role as governor of Java, Raffles was accused of financial mismanagement and recalled to England. After being recalled to England, Raffles fought to restore his position in the east. He managed to secure the position of lieutenant governor of the settlement of Bencoolen, located strategically near the Sunda Strait, one of the two straits that could be used to sail to China. Raffles, who feared the Dutch would blockade the routes to China, wanted to build a port. The Secret India Committee in Britain instructed him not to build a port in the Sunda Strait. Dissatisfied, Raffles decided that he would focus on the other strait, the Strait of Malacca.
Calcutta, October 16th, 1818. My dear sir, I have at last succeeded in making the authorities in Bengal sensible of their supineness in allowing the Dutch to exclude us from the eastern seas, but I fear it is now too late to retrieve what we have lost. I have full powers to do all we can, and if anything is to be done, I think one need not assure your grace that it shall be done, and quickly done. Lady Raffles has accompanied me. She is quite well, but finds the climate very different from that of our eastern isles. The heat has been extremely oppressive, and the whole of India very sickly. It is computed that not less than 2 millions have fallen a sacrifice to what is here called the cholera morbus. We are now on our way to the eastward, in the hope of doing something, but I much fear the Dutch have hardly left us an inch of ground to stand upon. My attention is principally turned to Johor, and you must not be surprised if my next letter to you is dated from the site of the ancient city of Singapore.
Now let's listen to his wife, Sophia Raffles, continue the story.
Although Sir Stamford did not succeed in his endeavours to induce the Bengal government to adopt all his views regarding Sumatra, his presence in Calcutta created a general interest and turned the attention of the merchants, as well as that of the government, towards the progress of the Dutch power and the probable total destruction of the English trade if some strong efforts were not made. If the moment was then allowed to pass away, the time would be over when anything could be done. The two only passages to the eastern archipelago secured by the Dutch, nothing but actual force would obtain for the British trader ingress to its 1,000 isles. In his own words, he neither wanted people nor territory. All he asked was permission to anchor a line of battleship and hoist the English flag at the mouth either of the Straits of Malacca or of Sunda, and the trade of England would be secured, the monopoly of the Dutch broken. Lord Hastings was convinced, and the occupation of Singapore was the consequence. Even before he left England, Sir Stamford contemplated this. To him, the classical spot was a place favourably situated to become a British station.
One of the key drivers to Raffles' success was that he was constantly reading and researching. He was effectively a storehouse of information that could be used to his advantage.
In my last letter, I referred to the island of Borneo, which is not only one of the most fertile countries in the world, but the most productive in gold and diamonds. The camphor which it produces is the finest in the world, and it is thought that it is capable of growing every species of spice. Its eastern coasts, which abound in sorgo, also produce a greater quantity of bird's nest, sea slug, and other commodities in great demand in the Chinese market than all the other islands of the east. But the interior has never been explored by Europeans. It may be conjectured that this ignorance of the state of the country is one of the principal causes that no European settlement has hitherto proved advantageous, but has generally been abandoned after a short trial. The Dayak, or original inhabitants of Borneo, not only industrious in their habits, but particularly devoted to agriculture and so manageable, that a handful of Malays have, in numerous places, reduced many thousands of them to the condition of peaceful cultivators of the ground. Indeed, nothing seems wanting to effect this on a great scale but a strong government, which can afford efficient protection to property and safety to the individuals, and in the case of the Dayak, I regard it as an advantage that they have not hitherto adopted the religion of Islam and would be ready from the first to regard us as their friends and protectors.
The Dayaks of the upper Sarawak River are known as the Badayu, but during colonial times, they were known as the Land Dayaks.
Who then are the Land Dayaks, and from whence have they come? This is no easy question to answer. I may sum up by repeating that the Sarawak Dayaks came in the first instance from Sekong, a village on Mount Sinjang. And if the legend can be believed, the Sekongs came from across the sea. The Sarawak Dayaks have the same traditions and assert that many ages ago, the whole country was underwater, and only the tops of the highest mountains such as Penrisen, Matang, and Sibungo were visible above the sea level. In old days, they say ships and boats came right across from what is now the Sambas coast past the Sibungo range to Sarawak. A small columnar mountain midway between Goombang and Gading called Jimas was then only just above water, and prows used to touch there for ballast and big stones for anchors. What importance we may attach to these traditions and stories, I leave geologists to decide. But it is very evident that the whole of Upper Sarawak has all the appearance of having been at some time under and exposed to the action of water.
The following is an adaptation of a Badayu myth.
Upon a boundless blue, where whispers roam, a group of sailors drifted in a vast prahu, their wooden world tossed by the endless waves. Finally, they ran aground upon the stark and lofty slopes of the mountain called Sinjang, where the ocean's breath seemed to surrender to the vast expanse of the sky. Then came a strange and subtle shift. The waters, which had carried them so far, began to weep away, receding from the shores of Sinjang. Thirsty earth, long submerged, stirred and slowly began to leap from its watery slumber, revealing itself in the vicinity of their stranded prahu. With hearts both hopeful and forlorn, the sailors left their grounded bark The threat of hunger, a dark shadow, loomed large before them in this newfound barren place. Just as despair began to tighten its grip, a miracle descended from the ethereal steep. A single large grain of rice fell from the azure depths of the sky, a blessing unexpected and divine. With reverence deep, their famished souls considered this gift. They shared the precious grain, each consuming only half, their hunger momentarily abated. The other half they held with the utmost care, recognizing its potential for future sustenance. This remaining portion they fractured into tiny gems and entrusted to the embrace of the newly revealed earth, burying the fragments in the clay. The grains they reaped in time were, of course, only as large as the pieces they had planted, a meager yield that mirrored their initial hope. Yet, as time unfolded, more and more land arose from the watery veils that had long concealed it, the silent ages turning the seabed into fertile ground. The sailors continued their practice of wisdom, consuming only half of their harvest and returning the other half to the bosom of the earth, trusting it to yield new life and sustenance. And so, their numbers swelled, like rivers finding their way to the vastness of the sea. They multiplied and spread across the land as its condition permitted, venturing over the territories of Sango, Landak, Sarawak, and into the more remote parts of the island, their descendants populating the emerging world.
Give us health and prosperity. May our farms produce much rice. May our trees bear fruit. Let our snares kill many pigs and deer, and the sea and the rivers, may they produce a sufficiency of fish, and may our wives have children, lots of them, particularly sons.
Dr. John Lydon, who's most famous for his translation of the Sejarah Melayu, also wrote A Sketch of Borneo.
The coasts of Borneo are occupied by a number of petty Mahometan states, none of which are of great antiquity. The original population of these is a mixture of Malays, Javanese, Bugis, and Makassars. But a small number of Arabs and a very considerable number of Chinese are always to be found in them. In many places of the island, the possessions of the Dayak extend quite to the shore. The maritime state of Borneo proper, or Brunei, are bounded on the west by the territories of Sambas and on the east by the Maludu and other districts nominally subject to the Sulus. The state of Borneo consequently occupies the most northerly districts of the island of Borneo. The government of Borneo is conducted by the Sultan and a council of his principal officers. The law of the land is the Undang-Undang Brunei, which is said to be of some antiquity.
As descriptive as that just was, what's interesting is that John Lydon never visited Brunei. Writings like this are compiled from different scraps of information from various travelers, explorers. There are even bits which have been translated from other languages. By far, one of the best descriptions of Brunei comes from George Tredescant Lay. Lay arrived in Brunei in May of 1837 on board the ship the Himalay. The Himalay was actually on a mission to Southeast Asia, partly to spread the gospel and partly to open up new trade routes for the American trading firm Oliphant and Company.
Borneo proper has, like the rest of the Malayan settlements, declined in wealth, activity and population, so that Chinese junks and the vessels from Macau and Manila no longer make their appearance as they were accustomed to do a few years ago. A Malay has a great affection for a house built upon the water, so that we often see the shallower parts of a bay covered with buildings, with only one here and there upon the land. The convenience of a natural sewer may have induced them to make such a choice, as they seem to confine themselves to places where the tide sweeps away the recrements of the inhabitants without any care or labour on their part. The houses extend on both sides of the river about 1.5 miles in a triple and often in a multiple row, so that it is not easy to guess at their number with a hope of coming near to the truth. On the north side, there is a row, which runs in a corresponding manner about a half a mile to the eastward, to which I reckon 300 houses and 3,000 inhabitants, but here there is a large divarication of the river, which, after a little distance, branches into several beautiful sources, or ulus as the natives call them. As Borneo proper has had but little intercourse with other nations, the ancient customs have been maintained in greater purity than in most other countries about the archipelago, if we except Java. Here we find the feudal system still in existence. The chieftain expects all kinds of service from his followers. The will of the sultan is the law of the land, modified, of course, by the influence which his councillors, nod-great men, exert upon him. He is elective, but the choice is limited to a single family. The nature of such an appointment leads to intrigue, quarrels, anti-vindictive measures, which may have been the cause of that anarchy that, a few years ago, drove away all the foreign vessels that used to trade at Borneo. On our first arrival at the city of Borneo, we did not reach the palace till midnight, a very unseasonable time, it must be confessed, to pay our respects to a great man. The Prime Minister and most of the principal chieftains were present, who took their seats upon the floor, while a settee and a few chairs accommodated the strangers. At length the Sultan appeared with as much pomp as his household could afford. We could discern a kind of mock majesty in his looks and an attempt at seriousness in his demands. But there was an idiot smile playing about his face, which betrayed the secret joy of his heart. The Sultan soon beckoned the interpreter to his side, that he might ask the nature of our errand, and such questions as our appearance might raise in his mind. We see a large hall of assembly, a throne and a large gong, with a hide stretched over the end of a hollow tree, which hangs in a shed at the end of a long jetty, that its deep tone may not be broken by conflicting echoes. His liege subjects are at times summoned by the sound of this instrument. In conformity with the Malayan custom when we may suppose him seated upon his throne in the midst of his guards, while everything is done to impress them with a sense of his royal magnificence. At other times, his councillors sit at his feet, the chieftains pay frequent visits of respect, and the Orankaya, or great men of the realm, who live at a distance, wait upon him from time to time, but in the midst of much real respect for his person and office, and 1,000 usages of ceremony observed with the most scrupulous attention. He seems to be only free to do evil. He can harass any part of his people, or put a chief to death. Because his own person is sacred, but for any benefit that he might wish to confer upon the general welfare, he is solely dependent upon the wisdom and integrity of his minister. Such, if we reason truly, is a kingly denomination without a free constitution and a virtuous community. It may do as much mischief as it pleases, but to do good it hath no might. In all Malay governments there are certain persons called mantri, or privy councillors, many of whom, if not all, are so constituted by special appointment. The minister, to whom we have referred more than once, is the chief executive officer in the state. The distinction between him and the Sultan was very concisely made by a brother of the latter in conversation with myself and fellow traveller one evening. The one speaks and the other acts. The entire control and management of all public matters are placed in the hands of the latter, who, from the advantage of such a situation when a man of talent, like Muda Hasim, can enact his own pleasure, and so leave the Sultan a mere pompous trifle, surrounded indeed with the tools of war and majesty, but destitute of any real power or authority.
The Sultan's authority extended as far west as the Kingdom of Sarawak. If we round the corner down to the west coast of Borneo, we reach the Kingdom of Sambas. The Sultan of Sambas accepted Dutch suzerainty in 1818.
In the year 1831, the then resident of the west coast of Borneo, Mr. Gronovius, drew the attention of the Dutch East Indian government to the desirableness and necessity of concluding a treaty of friendship with the Sultan of Borneo proper, to whose kingdom, as is well known, Sarawak also belongs. The small trade of that kingdom, which then nearly all found its way to Singapore, would be considerably led back to our Dutch possessions in general, and above all to Sambas and Pontianak, two Dutch settlements on Borneo. But above all, by such a treaty, no foreign nation would be able to settle itself there. Whilst, if the Sultan thereby ceded to us some small districts of little importance to him, such as Lundu, Samatan, and Sarawak, lying on the borders of Sambas, the smuggling trade there could be much better prevented. The chief aim of this contract was intended to be thereby to place a counterprize to the free port of Singapore. Although there were then no direct attempts made from Singapore to open up a new road for English trade on Borneo or to acquire a territorial settlement there, yet he foresaw that sooner or later this would be the case, and he anticipated what a sensible damage would thereby be caused to our interests. He suggested a mission to be sent to Borneo proper. A Pangeran of Sambas, empowered by the government for that purpose, went to Borneo proper, remained there 9 months, and came back without having performed anything.
This failure opened the door for British merchants. One of these merchants was George Windsor Earl.
In the year 1834, soon after my return from the west coast of the island, an enterprising Armenian merchant of Singapore dispatched a ship there for the purpose of opening a trade, and the commander, an Englishman and an Armenian gentleman on board, were well received by the Raja, who appeared highly desirous of establishing a commercial intercourse with the British settlement. The ship returned to Singapore with a valuable cargo of pepper, camphor, gold dust, and diamonds. Several vessels, chiefly dispatched by the Armenians, have since visited Borneo proper, and the trade appears to be established on a secure footing. The Dutch have established themselves on the western coast, and many towns which at their arrival were of some consequence have either been reduced to insignificance or totally destroyed, while others have risen to importance, and Europeans having penetrated very far into the interior, the country has become better known. The west coast of Borneo, from the mouth of the Sambas River to Point Datu, the northwest extremity, with the exception of the town of Sarawak, is very little known, even to the Malays. No extensive river has been found there, and as the Dayak tribes which inhabit the banks of the numerous creeks have not yet been tamed by communication with foreigners and are always in want of human heads, the native traders have no inducement to visit these districts in the furtherance of their commercial pursuits. The town of Sarawak is situated in a bay to the eastward of Point Api, at the foot of a range of mountains from 1,500 to 3,000 feet high, extending towards the interior of the island. The rapidity with which Sarawak has risen to importance proves how very little encouragement the natives require to induce them to turn the valuable productions of the island to account. Soon after the establishment of Singapore, some people from Borneo proper, who had touched at Sarawak to procure water on their voyage to the settlement, brought with them a large lump of metal ore which they had picked up there. This, after puzzling the Chinese for some time, was stumbled upon by some English gentlemen who discovered it to be antimony ore of a very superior quality.
Antimony was discovered to be an abundant product of Sarawak in 1825, found then by mere accident. A person strolling through the market of Singapore picked up a mass of it and found, not by his skill in mineralogy, for he had none, but by the use to which it was put, the enhancing of the brilliancy of the women's eyes by applying it as a cosmetic to the edges of the eyelids, that it was a sulphurate of antimony. The history given by the native shopkeeper with whom the mineral was found was this. Small quantities used to be imported from the ports on the Persian Gulf, which served the Malays of the neighborhood for years. And at that time, the price used to be about $70 per picul of 133 pounds. But in 1824, a year before, a native trader of Borneo had imported a quantity of it as ballast to his prow, and the price at Singapore fell at once to $9. The place from which the ore was introduced was ascertained to be Sarawak in Borneo. A portion of the ore was smelted in the presence of the principal Chinese merchants. An account of the discovery was published in the local newspaper. The native traders were encouraged to import it, and the European merchants to send it to England as dead weight. The trade was at once established, and now there is yearly imported into this country about 1,000 tons of the antimony ore of Borneo, which forms the principal supply of the kingdom. I, John Crawfurd, was in charge at the time alluded to of the civil administration of Singapore, and was in fact the person that strolling in the marketplace lighted on the massive sulphurate of antimony caused it to be smelted and published an account of it.
To the editor of the Government Gazette. Sir, I am induced to trouble you with a few remarks on a paragraph which has lately appeared in the Singapore Chronicle, relative to the ore of antimony. For the observations evince a very imperfect knowledge of the subject and are calculated to deceive the good folks of that promising settlement. I will now recapitulate to the best of my information the uses to which antimony is applied, that your readers may be enabled to judge how far it would be prudent to export it from Singapore in any quantity. In printing types, the regulus of antimony forms about 1/5 part. In the best pewter 1/6, in hard pewter 1/12. In Queen's metal 1/12, in Britannia metal 1/15. In medicine, the use of the oxide of antimony has been long known, but it is not, I believe, so general as formerly. As a pigment for coloring the eyebrows, etc., its use has been confined to Asiatics. But it may not be so generally known that the beautiful orange dye of the calico printers is obtained from antimony.
In the year 1818, the whole of the direct British trade with the Straits of Malacca, and generally with the Eastern Islands, excluding Java, centered at Penang, or Prince of Wales's island, the exports from which amounted to no more than 2,030,757 Spanish dollars. This was in the year immediately preceding the establishment of Singapore. In 1824, the joint exports of Penang and Singapore amounted to 9,414,464 Spanish dollars, of which those of Singapore amounted to 6,604,601 Spanish dollars. In other words, this branch of the British trade had been considerably more than quadrupled in the short period of little more than 6 years. From Singapore in 1825, 250 tons of antimony ore was exported to England, and in 1826, very nearly 600 tons.
On learning that this commodity would be purchased at a good price by the merchants of Singapore, the Raja of Borneo proper sent a small party of his people to Sarawak, and a friendly intercourse was soon established with the Dayaks, who brought down large quantities of the ore which they exchanged for beads, red cloth, iron, etc. Soon afterwards, the Malay chiefs of Sambas, who were glad of an opportunity of carrying on a commerce free from the control of the Dutch, purchased 2 or 3 brigs and ships which they employed in the trade. In a few years, the annual importation of antimony ore at Singapore amounted to 1,400 tons. The ore, which is called, I believe, foliated antimony, is found either on or immediately under the surface of the ground, and is to be obtained with so much facility that 100 tons may be exchanged with the Dayaks for goods to the amount of little more than the same number of dollars. The ore is readily purchased from $16 to $20 per ton by the merchants of Singapore, who transmit it in its crude state to England. As the goods exported from Singapore are chiefly of a light description, the antimony ore proves very useful as ballast for ships. The freight to Europe is therefore very low, rarely exceeding 35 shillings per ton.
In the days of the native government, trade was a curse. And sorry am I to add that through this trade, the European merchant, perhaps unwittingly, was adding coals to the fire of rebellion then smouldering in the country. In former days, Malay Rajas were all more or less traders. Government was only nominal, its functions were mercantile. Markets for the exchange of native produce for Europe's cheap wares were open at the Dutch and English settlements, and from these ports traders occasionally sailed for Borneo in search of its mineral and vegetable riches. Antimony was known to exist in Sarawak. Some few ships went direct there, but others had to go to Brunei, where after making a certain payment they would get from the Sultan an order on the governor of Sarawak for the ore. On arriving there, the supercargo would show his order to the governor. A mandate would then go forth desiring the Malay chiefs to produce a certain quantity of antimony works. And there they and the Dayaks were forced to work the mineral at the extremely inadequate price of a cup of salt, or from 1 to 3 cents per pikul. The forced trade of the Malay Rajas who, to load their prahus or to fill his stores, and so make a handsome profit for every European who might come to deal with him, together with an enormous gain to himself, would compel his subjects, the land Dayaks, to work without wages, to sell without gain, and to become debtors or slaves because they could not do impossibilities, and were then unable to pay the fines inflicted for the non-performance of these impossibilities. These were the causes which threw this country into rebellion. Thus, while a large profit was reaped by the Sultan, who gave his permission to purchase the ore, by the Raja, who sold it, by the chiefs, who carried out his orders, and by the merchant, who bought it and disposed of it again at a profit of cent per cent, the unfortunate labourer suffered, because to work the ore, his farming and ordinary avocations were necessarily neglected, and his family reduced to starvation. Hence, the very name of antimony was hated by the working classes. No wonder that rebellion was the result.
My experience here enables me to affirm, from the distracted state of the Sarawak government and the depression of the people, that trade, instead of being a blessing, is a curse, and that the richer a country is, and the greater the demand by European vessels for any staple commodity, the more wretched are the inhabitants, and the more rapacious the chiefs, who drive the people to unrequited labour, as long as there is any demand, to the neglect of their agricultural pursuits on which they depend for food. The chief grows rich, but the people are abjectly poor, and the country is ruined by the desertion or rebellion of its inhabitants.
Antimony ore. About 1,700 piculs arrived this week from Sarawak and were immediately sold at $1.50 Spanish dollars cash. We learn that no less than 5,000 piculs may be expected here from the same quarter in the course of a month.
In this rebellion, the Dayaks at first sided with the Malays of Sarawak, and so long as this was the case, Governor Indera Makota feared to attack the rebels at Leda Tana, Siniawan, and Belida. It was therefore necessary to bring the Dayaks under, and to this end, Makota leagued himself with the great Arab chief, Serif Sahib. This man, who was the notorious leader and instigator of most of the piracy on the coast, was in power over Sardong, Skaran, and Seribas. A large force of the head-hunting Dayaks from the last two rivers was collected, and, accompanied by a body of Malays, was marched against the inland Dayaks of Sarawak. Centaur was one of the first tribes attacked, and those who were not cut off were dispersed in the interior. Then Brang was attacked. The Brang people placed great reliance in the difficulty of approach up their steep hill. The men quietly sat and ate their rice, and the women went to the top of the peak above the village and openly defied the invading force. They turned their backs to the invaders and screamed yells of defiance. O valorous females, did that stern defiance avail you? No, the alarm was spread. The Seribas are approaching. They have muskets, we have none. Fire the houses, fly, fly. And that night, the Seribas were victors, and over their watchfires hung some hundreds of brang heads, while mangled bodies lay strewed about the jungle. Some indeed had escaped decapitation to win slavery, and very probably they and their children are now headhunters like their Sarabas captors. Some 20 or 30 families escaped to the jungle, but it was many years before they finally returned to that blood-stained spot where they had seen fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, and children cruelly murdered or taken into slavery. The Sao people. Formerly, they were a large tribe, numbering, I have been told, 400 or 500 families, and they all lived in a town named Beratak, situated on a spur of the Sao range of hills. So strong were the Saos in former days that they successfully repulsed an attack made upon them by the Seribas and Skarans, the very terror of both land and sea. In a former part of my narrative, I mentioned the attack made upon the Sarawak Dayaks at the instance of the governor Pangeran Indera Makota. The attack was made in person by Serif Japa, the brother of Serif Sahib, the great piratical chief, with his head-hunting Dayak subjects. I mentioned, too, how so long as the Sarawak Dayaks sided with the Sarawak Malays in their rebellion, the Brunei authorities deemed their cause desperate, how they leagued with this Arab chief and his brothers to lay the Aborigines of Sarawak in desolation, and how Centaur and Brang were attacked and burnt. The rebel Malays were then fortified at Leda Tana, Belida, and Siniawan. The Malay Datus at the former place heard that simultaneous attacks were to be made on Senta and Sao, Sirif Sahib's forces undertaking the former, whilst his brother, Sirif Japa, was to head the latter. The Malays, who would otherwise have acted as allies to the Dayaks, were thus unable to decide in which direction to move, and the result was that both Senta and Sao had to defend themselves without assistance. The Sao Dayaks had sickness in their town and were pamali, or obliged to remain at home, for a certain number of days. They had fortified their village in native fashion and were ready to resist the invaders. And faith, they did it, and so successfully that the Serebas and Scarans left hundreds of their comrades wounded, or more likely, without their heads. The pursuit was followed up all the forenoon, and Sirif Japa and a large party had to pass through a plain of lalang grass, which from long drought was very dry. The Sao Dayaks surrounded them and fired the grass. Those who were not burned to death had to run the gauntlet of all the Dayaks. Sirif Japa escaped, but left his arms behind. Also, a valuable warhead dress covered with Arab charms, which the Dayaks got and still treasure as a great trophy. Fighting here is not what it is in civilized countries. Hand-to-hand fights there may be, but their warfare is generally of a more sneaking character. With leilas or guns, muskets, spears, etc., they will keep their strongholds, while parties will go sneaking about the jungle in search of stray enemies. And when they have successfully resisted an attack and see the enemy retreating, they will harass his rear, securing as many heads as possible to take home as trophies. The Saos, on the occasion to which I have alluded, were in grand spirits at this, their victory, a victory never before achieved against the Serebas and Scarans. But their joy was short-lived. They had reckoned too much on their security and forgot the bitterness created in the hearts of their foes by their repulse and loss. It was not many months afterwards, on a fine sunny day, when most of them were busily engaged at their farms, that, with the suddenness of a flash of lightning, and without any warning, the Saos found themselves surrounded by their lately discomfited enemies. They looked around for means of escape, but alas, their retreat was cut off. Each man looked for his comrade, but scattered as they were, that was hopeless, and that day the Saos were no longer victors, but vanquished. Between 300 and 400 dead bodies lay strewed on or around the farms, and their bloodthirsty foemen were hastening back to their villages, laden with as many heads soon to be presented to wives and birds as proofs of prowess and claims for the fulfillment of pledged words, or else to be suspended in the victor's hall of leaves and to be caressed and spat upon by turns. Besides the heads, the enemy carried off as captives 100 women and children. From that day, the Sao tribe has been broken into bits. One chief retired with his followers to Jaguai and formed that settlement, now so pretty. Another established himself at Grogo, where we now were, and the smaller villages of Pendit, Aup, Krokong, Tota, Siar, and Suba rose in the place of the once large and flourishing town of Beratak.
The news of the turmoil in Sarawak had reached Brunei.
Muda Hashim invited us to his residence. As the boat proceeded but slowly, we did not reach the residence of this man till midnight. After we had waited long enough to compose our thoughts and reckon up all the particulars of our errand, Muda Hashim stepped forth, and with an easy air shook hands with his guests, and then presented each of them with a cigar of about a foot in length. This little ceremony being over, he sat down before us, and then looked round with a studied but pleasant smile. At the first sight of him, the uproar instantly subsided, without hurry or bustle in taking their places. Every native sank down upon the floor with that noiseless ease and address which are the result of early habit, nor was the remnant of a smile left upon a single visage in the company. One could perceive in him a certain consciousness of his rank and mental superiority, which he exhibited as much, perhaps, to honour his guests as to exalt himself. The peaceful state of things at Borneo, when we saw it, was due to the merits of this man, which, when we consider them in reference to what we see in the rest of his countrymen, seem to be of no ordinary kind. The order of his household and the character of the persons about him afforded a great contrast to what we saw at the palace of the Sultan. In one we have a motley group of ill-favoured sycophants, whose business it is to execute the dirty errands of their master and to abet him in all his knavish practices in the other. We have men of a respectable bearing, and, whatever may be some of their moral delinquencies, they appear to understand that it is their duty to perform the biddings of a spirited and enterprising chief, and not merely to wait upon his vices. He is anxious to introduce improvements among the people, and takes the surest way to accomplish his wishes by setting the example in his own establishment. He was meditating a visit to all the neighbouring places upon the coast which acknowledged the supremacy of Borneo in order to bind them to that state by leagues of confederacy and exchanges of mutual confidence. It was said that he was very anxious that the Himalay should accompany him, as it would have added very much to the importance of his mission. It seemed an opportunity so desirable that I lost no time in expressing my belief that such a stopping out of the line of our instructions would please the projectors of the voyage, and also my readiness to share in the blame should any be incurred by it. But, as this was not set down in our master's instructions, the offer was declined.
Sometime after this meeting in June 1837, the Sultan sent Muda Hashim to Kuching to try and restore order.
The great evil, the chief cause which prevents the advancement of Malay countries, is that merchants and traders must deal with the chiefs or pangerans, and these pangerans wring the poor, especially the Dayaks, out of all their goods without offering any equivalent value. The consequence being that the population at large will not be at the trouble of working or seeking produce for which they get nothing. I have known produce worth $20 at Singapore, for which the Dayaks received 1 teacupful of salt. Can we be surprised that they will not work?
The Singapore Free Press and Mercantile Advertiser, 16th August 1838. Report on the Market Eastern articles, antimony ore. None in first hands, but about 8 or 10,000 pikios expected in the course of a month.
On the 15th December, 1838, the brig Napoleon being all ready for sea, with everything staunch and sound, having on board about 2,000 piculs of antimony ore and 3 cases merchandise, drawing 11 feet 6 inches aft and 9 feet 4 inches forward, at about 6 a.m. we left Sarawak town, and on the 17th at 9 a.m. reached and came to, off the first point from the entrance of the river at Santubong. There were passing squalls and rain at intervals, with a heavy swell from the northwest. We found the swell increasing towards the bar, about 2 miles off Pulau Kara. At 8 a.m., the chain cable parted, and the brig got athwart the tide. A heavy sea struck her on the starboard bow, washed away the spars, and swamped the launch which was laying on the starboard side, ready to tow the brig out with 2 men in her, at the same time filling her deck with water. Shortly after the brig struck, she unshipped the rudder and broke it into 2 under the counter. We sounded the well and found about 4 feet water in her hold, not thinking it prudent to let any more anchors go, as the brig was in a sinking state and sagging towards Santubong Point. About noon, the sea breeze set in, and we set sail to let her go aground on shore. The swell lifted her at intervals, and while the crew was in the act of getting in the whaleboat, the brig suddenly heeled over on her larboard beam ends. The crew rushed into the whaleboat and shove off, as there was a very heavy sea washing right over the brig. The whaleboat, with 14 the crew on board, were landing when it was dashed to pieces in the surf on the beach. When the launch was swamped, we saw 1 seaman carried out to sea by the ebb tide, but the other, having by some means held on for a considerable time to the launch, was washed ashore with the flood tide. 6 of us were now left on different parts of the wreck, seeing the cabin and quarterdecks afloat. The brig had heeled over so much on her beam ends that the main mast, to the rigging of which Mr. J. Cook, Master D. Cook, and myself had clung for safety and support, was almost on a level with the sea when the swell at intervals receded. But when the sea ran again, masts, rigging, and ourselves would for a minute at times remain under water. Seeing little chance of relief from a watery grave, and the principle of self-preservation driving every other kindlier feeling for my fellow sufferers still on the wreck, I flung myself, form the main top, into the sea. Observing at the same time one of the pumps floating along, I pushed myself on and caught the pump, which brought me on shore. A heavy sea jerked the rigging from the grasp of Mr. D. Cook, and about 10 minutes later, his brother, Mr. J. Cook, saw him floating along, a corpse. Mr. J. Terze, having fallen in the after part of the vessel, was there entangled among loose rigging another rope, and was seen at every receding swell, attempting but unable to extricate himself from his perilous situation. He was, for a very long time, heard crying for help, ere he perished. By the next morning, we could not see any more of the brig Napoleon. We rigged a raft and sent her up to Sarawak town to procure us some assistance from the Rajah. 5 boats came off from the King of Sarawak to convey us up to town, found Mr. J. Peters and D. Cook, apprentice, and 1 Bengal Lascar missing from the list of the ship's company. About 5 p.m. arrived at Sarawak town and put ourselves under the protection of Muda Hasim Raja of Sarawak. In concluding my sad tale, I cannot but record my highest sense of the generous, humane and friendly conduct of the Sarawak chief towards us. When we reached shore, we were in a state of perfect nudity, but on our arrival in town, we were abundantly supplied with clothes and every comfort which Sarawak could afford. During the 96 days we were under his protection, he made it his unceasing study to add to our comfort and enjoyment. And under his roof and in all Sarawak town, we enjoyed the utmost personal security. When the Spanish brig Pronto arrived at Sarawak for water, it brought us to Singapore. It was her intention to refund the Raja Muda Hasim for all expenses he had incurred on our account. But the good feelings of the chief would not permit him to listen even to the distant allusion to be made to his liberal conduct towards us. It may never perhaps be in my power to make the smallest return in any shape to Muda Hasim Raja of Borneo, at present residing at Sarawak, but I trust to the latest period of my existence to cherish a lively sense of his great urbanity of manners and his generous and friendly behavior towards me and my fellow sufferers. I remain, Mr. Editor, your obedient servant, J. Berwitz, Master of the Napoleon.
On the 27th of July, 1839, Captain James Brooke departs from Singapore.
On Saturday at noon, we got underway with a light breeze and stood down the strait on our way to Borneo. It may not be superfluous to recount here the preparations I have made for this trip to Borneo, or my intentions when I get there. Borneo proper, once the seat of piracy, which few vessels could approach with safety, is now under the sway of the Raja Muda Hasim. The character given this Raja by many persons who know and have traded with him is so good, and he is spoken of as generous and humane and greatly inclined to the English. These reasons have induced me to abandon my intention of proceeding direct to Maludu Bay, and during the season of the southwest monsoon to confine myself principally to the northwest coast. Muda Hasim, being at present reported to be at Sarawak, I propose, after taking a running sketch of the coast from Tanjong Api, to enter the river of that name and proceed as far as the town. I believe I have availed myself of every means within my reach to render my visit agreeable to the Raja. I carry with me many presents which are reported to be to his liking: gaudy silks of Surat, scarlet cloth, stamped velvet, gunpowder, etc., besides a large quantity of confectionery and sweets such as preserved ginger, jams, dates, syrups, and to wind up all, a huge box of china toys for his children. I have likewise taken coarse nankeen to the amount of £100 value as the best circulating medium in the country. Besides the above-mentioned preparations, I carry letters from the government of Singapore to state, as far as can be done, the objects of my voyage, and to caution the Raja to take every care of my safety and that of my men. The Singapore Board of Commerce have at the same time entrusted me with a letter and present to him, to thank him for his humanity to a crew of an English vessel wrecked on his coast. The story, as I had it from the party shipwrecked, is highly creditable to his humanity. The vessel, called the Napoleon, was wrecked on the bar of Sarawak River in the northeast monsoon. The people were saved with difficulty and remained in the jungle, where they were after a time discovered by some Malays. Muda Hasim, on receiving intelligence of this, sent down and brought them to his town, collected all that he could recover from the wreck, clothed them handsomely, and fed them well for several months, and, on an opportunity arriving, sent them back to Singapore free of expense. At the same time, however, that I have prepared to meet the natives as friends, I have not neglected to strengthen my crew in case I should find them hostile. 8 stout men of the Orang Laut, or men of the sea, Malays, have been added to the force. They are an athletic race, cheerful and willing, and though not seamen in our sense of the term, yet well calculated for this expedition. They pull a good oar and are invaluable in saving the Europeans the exposure consequent to wooding and watering. They possess likewise the knowledge of the jungle and its resources, and 2 of them have before been to Sarawak and along the coast. Besides these, a young gentleman named Williamson accompanies me as interpreter. With these arrangements, I look without apprehension to the power of the Malays, but without relaxing in measures of the strictest vigilance, I shall never sleep less soundly when it comes to my turn so to do.
This brings us to the end of episode 1 of the Borneo Chronicles podcast, supported by the Goethe Institute Malaysia.